Hello, this is Jim Pellegrino, your host for the hour. In our second segment of the show, we have Connecticut State Senator Len Suzio. Len?
Hey, Jim.
Pleasure to have you. Good to see you again.
Boy, it's been a long time.
It's been a long time. Good to see you. Well, it won't be a long time for long, Len. We'll probably have you on again. Listen, for the audience's benefit, Len represents Cheshire and Meriden and Middletown and Middlefield. He's on the Education Committee, the Critical Appropriations Committee, and also in the private sector world, Len is president and founder of Geodata Vision. So, you are a recently newly elected state senator and right in the middle of all this stuff going on. So give me and the audience some quick first impressions of what life is like in the Connecticut State General Assembly, Len.
Well, as you know, I was dropped in the middle of the session. I didn't get elected in the normal election cycle. I was elected in a special election. So I joined the legislature on February 28th, about 6 weeks after the session began. So
that's about a 5-month, something like that, right?
It was unbelievable. It was very hectic, and of course, of all years to start in the legislature, this has to be one of the most dramatic, basically. And to say the least, it was hectic. Some of the things that surprised me, the sheer volume of legislation that was introduced. 3,523 bills were introduced.
And in your opinion, Len, let me ask you the first question. How many of those are totally superfluous to anything?
Oh, yeah. I'd say 90% of them easily.
90%, and of the remaining 10%, Len, how many focused, net of the budget, how many focused on job creation?
Most of them focused on job uncreation, I would say. I mean, they were spending money and creating more tax requirements, basically. So it was a very, you asked for a general impression. I would say most of the legislature has no clue about what it's like to run a business, what's needed to meet a payroll and that kind of a thing. And most of them are just driven by the idea of big government is the answer to everything. And that's why I think we have a big problem in Connecticut today.
Let's do a little quick lightning round first. In the middle of all this economy situation that we have, the Connecticut State General Assembly, of course, always find times to spend their time on other things. Just some lightning round. Tell me how you voted on the following things, and if you want to put a couple of words beside it, do so, Len.
Sure.
How about the legalizing of marijuana?
I voted against that, just quickly, because basically I believe when you use a substance that is hallucinogenic, and that's the way it works, it really causes you to lose control of your faculties. And people can argue about how bad it is or whatever, but I just don't think that's, I think that's self-abuse of your body, basically.
Okay, so that was a no vote.
You're right.
How about the death penalty repeal?
That didn't come up, actually.
Oh, it did not come up?
It was going to be voted on, and then two prominent supporters of the repeal, Edith Prague and Senator Maynard, Senator Prague and Maynard, announced a week or so before that they were not going to support it. They had met personally
with Dr. Pettit.
Right, and Edith Prague made her famous or infamous pronouncement at that time about what they should do with the killers of the Pettis.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
That pulled it off the table.
Fairly colorful description.
It'll be up next year, though. I'm certain of that.
Yeah, but if it came up, Len, how would you vote on repealing?
I would have, at this point in time, I would have voted against repeal.
Repealing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm open and I'm thinking about, you know, the arguments. I think you have to be open-minded as a legislator, but I've always believed that in the limited use of the death penalty and in extremely, you know, circumstances that are particularly heinous, or killing of an officer in the line of duty, things like that, I've always felt were legitimate uses of the death penalty. I don't believe we should be doing it every week. But in Connecticut, we've had only one execution in the last 50 years.
And he asked for it.
That's right. He begged for it.
He asked for it.
So.
Okay, how about in-state tuition for illegal immigrants?
Oh, I was opposed to that. And not only because, I mean, it's not because I have no sympathy or empathy for the children of immigrants, whether legal or illegal, but basically I felt two things. It encouraged law breaking, it kind of rewards law breaking, and number two, there's actually a conflict with a federal law. 8 U.S.C. 1623 is a law that was passed by the federal government back in 1997, I think it was, and it basically says that any state that offers secondary or post-education, secondary education benefits to illegal or non-registered aliens has to offer it to every citizen of the country. So that basically leaves the potential that Connecticut could be responsible to eliminate all out-of-state tuition, which would, I calculated, would cost the state $100 million or more. And the proponents think it'll benefit 200 to 250 kids.
Now, did that wind up getting voted on?
It was. It was voted on. It was passed, and the governor signed it yesterday, in fact.
And you voted?
I voted against it. Right.
Okay. Next was the mandatory sick leave.
Again, I voted against that. That was interesting, by the way. Again, that's one of those anti-business bills. You know, this show we're not going to go into depth, but I can tell you, just to give you an example, the Franciscans contacted me.
Franciscan nuns.
The Franciscan nuns. They run a number of services for the elderly, and they said, don't support this. This is disastrous for us because we don't have any profit margins, and any additional cost is going to make it more difficult for us to sustain operations. And we're doing a lot of this for the state of Connecticut under a revenue stream that hasn't been changed for 6 or 7 years. So we really haven't been adjusted for inflation, and now you're going to add this. So please don't vote for this. And so I submitted an amendment to exempt them and other nonprofits from the arrangement, and it was turned down on a party line vote, basically. So they wouldn't even support the Little Sisters of the Poor.
So Connecticut, so Connecticut now has a dubious, I guess, distinction of being the only state in the United States of America that does this.
Yeah, that's mandatory.
That's mandatory. Right. Makes it mandatory.
That's right.
Okay. You gave me a nice segue with your little editorial comment about business unfriendly. Listen, Len, the book on the state of Connecticut, and I experience it when I travel outside the state. I'm sure you experience it when you travel outside the state without leading the witness too much. I mean, there is a perception that Connecticut is a business unfriendly state. And it's killing us.
Yes.
We're losing a lot of businesses, small businesses. And to me, and more importantly, Len, we're losing a lot of young people under the age of 32.
Right.
Some of our best and brightest young men and women who graduate from school and leave.
That's right. That's right. And it's because...
So what is it about the Connecticut State General Assembly that doesn't understand that business equals jobs equals revenue? What's so hard about that equation?
Well, I think a lot of the General Assembly is dominated by people that see government as the salvation for everything, and they see government as the job creator, which is really ironic. Government doesn't create jobs. Government should get out of the way of creating jobs. It's the private sector that creates jobs and creates wealth. The government sector takes part of that wealth and uses it to help. Exactly. So that I have no problem with. But basically, to have this inverted attitude that government somehow is the source of job creation and the source of wealth creation has got it totally backward. And that's one reason why we have problems. The state of Connecticut has a tax structure that's anti-business, and it's got a regulatory structure that's anti-business. So you've got this, plus you've got costs like the cost of electricity, the cost of power. Here in Connecticut, it's the second highest in the country. So you've got energy costs that are disproportionate, you've got regulations that are unfriendly and unsympathetic, and you've got a tax structure that is adverse to business.
But you know what, Len? I mean, your fellow senators and the people in the General Assembly, the House version of it, on Chris Donovan's side.
Right.
I mean, all of these people, including yourself, these are not unintelligent people. For the most part, they're intelligent people.
Right.
What myself and a lot of other people don't understand is how do supposedly intelligent people, I mean, intellectually they're smart, but I wonder about their street savvy sometimes. How are they so insulated that they don't see what the business perception of, I mean, why should I move into Connecticut?
Right.
Why should I expand in Connecticut? And I know I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but I'm not all that far off.
Oh, no.
Why don't they see it, Leonard?
Well, you know, interesting enough, I had a dinner 2 weeks ago with an old high school classmate of mine who's now a doctor, and we were talking about the same issue, how some of our classmates we were the smartest kids in the class. We were in the top 10%, you know, in the National Honor Society and all that, and some of us went one way in terms of philosophy, and others went the other way. Mark and I went on the conservative route, and we were talking about specifically Senator Looney was one of those people that was
Martin
a classmate.
Looney. Yeah.
Yep. And there were a couple of other guys, and I remember Mark said to me, my friend, he said, Lenny, think about this. It's not for lack of intelligence. I mean, you know, our friends are very smart, and we were at the top of the class too, but we have a profoundly different viewpoint on the role of government in life. And you know, a conservative viewpoint is government basically is there to do minimal things to help you out when you're down, but it doesn't do anything beyond that. It's not supposed to be hand out, it's supposed to be hand up. But most people on the liberal side of the equation look at it that it's supposed to be there for handouts. And I think you can see it in a lot of the policies that are being enacted, Jim. It's a fundamental philosophical difference about life in general and what the role of government is.
But I guess let me close it with this, Len. I'll close that portion with this. I mean, it's one thing if you are in an entity, and outside that entity, there aren't all sorts of opinion, whether it's public opinion or business associations or ratings and rankings from the President's Bulletin in the United States of America, whatever all those external stimuli are, and they're all saying the same thing, it's almost like you can't penetrate. You can't penetrate and get in there and say, will you wake up and see what's happening?
Well, let me just give you a good example of how this boils down to in real life. During the debate on the paid sick leave, the proponents were saying, oh, it's only 0.5% of cost or whatever, and they're looking at it as relative to 100% gross revenues. I said to them, you don't understand. Most businesses survive on a very small profit margin, maybe 2%.
Right.
So when you're talking about 0.5% more in cost, it doesn't sound like a lot to you, but it's 25% of the company's profit margin. And a lot of restaurants, which are going to be very much affected, they're really on the razor's edge to begin with. In many cases, they're barely making it, maybe a very tiny profit, 1%. So you take 0.5%, you just knocked off half of their profit if they're making even that. And they don't understand it. See, they don't have real life experience, Jim, in terms of running a business and the real costs of doing it. And I think that's one of the big problems.
Len, I've often thought, and this will never happen, but I've often thought, over there in Israel, every man and woman, I think, once they hit the age of 18, has got to put a year or two in the armed services.
Right, right.
And what an experience that is to go into the armed services, having done that, right?
Yes.
I almost wish in the wonderful United States of America that every young person, after they graduate, whatever they graduate, high school, college, whatever it is, that they have to spend a year or two in the private sector. And I almost wish that they would have the experience of knowing what it's like to run your own business, having to meet a payroll and see what it's like.
Maybe that's the equivalent of a jobs corps. I think you're 100% right, because a lot of times I've related my fellow legislators to being teenagers, who, like my son, who always wanted the new car. No concept of cost, no concept of responsibility. It's just there. The money's there, so spend it. And they don't have the real life experience, I think, of that.
All right, let's go to the next subject before we get into budgets and negotiation. We're probably halfway through already. Why can't the Republicans, and Lenny, you're a Republican, all right? And you've been there for 5 or 6 months now.
Right.
Do you have any insight into why it's been, pick a number, 30, 35, 40 years since the Republicans have controlled the General Assembly? What is wrong with the Republican Party that they can't make that inroad?
Right. It will actually, going back to the late 70s, there's been only one legislative session in which the Republicans had a majority of the Senate.
Of the Senate?
Yeah, Senate. That was it. I think it was 94 to 96, if I'm not mistaken. Other than that, the General Assembly's been dominated by Democrats for all these years. And you just asked the $64 million question, because a lot of Republicans are saying, well, why can't we be more successful appealing to people? And I think my election really is an example of what can be done, Jim. I won in a district. The last time it was won by a Republican was 1972. 39 years ago. It was a shock to everybody that I won in a district, by the way, too. The registration is 3-to-1, or almost 3-to-1, Democrat to Republican. So you're starting off with a 50-pound ball tied to your legs. But I always said that I think that part of the problem is the Republican Party has not adequately distinguished itself from the Democratic Party. It's more like Democrat light, basically. And I've said that we've got to present a clear and distinctive difference with Democrats philosophically across a whole range of issues, not just financial issues, although that's big and maybe predominant today. And so when I went out in this election and it was one-on-one, me versus my Democratic opponent, I think it proved that, because I'm an unabashed conservative right down the line, and I'm not shy about expressing that in a respectful, thoughtful way, of course, not a belligerent way. And my opponent was just the opposite. He was a far left liberal, basically. So it was truly a contest of not just two persons and two personalities, but two philosophies. And the surprising thing was not only that I won, but I won by 58 to 42 or something like that. It was a pretty big victory.
Yeah, well, we'll close this out, Len, by me telling you that I agree with you 100%. I yearn for the days when almost like a Pavlovian experiment. You could say the word Democrat, and this is now, you got to go back 30, 35, 40 years to get this. You could say the word Democrat, and in people's mind, 3 or 4 bullets would come up.
Right.
You'd say Republican, and 3 or 4 bullets would come up. You would know that as members of those parties, this is what those people stand for.
That's right.
And you're absolutely right. What's happened is there's been a blur, and then there's a fringe on both sides.
Right.
And, you know, I think most people are sick of all of it.
Oh, I agree.
You just want to know
There's
where
a
people
general
stand.
distress at both parties.
Let's go into budgets and negotiations, et cetera. Let me tell you where I think we are, and then you tell me, okay? Sure. Apparently, in this last session that you guys had at the end of last week, from July 1st to September 30th, the governor has been granted an increase in his rescission authority, the ability to cut funding from 5 to 10%. Right. He can also reduce aid to municipalities by 2%. He's got to show if the negotiations, well, they haven't been successful, if they reopen it, they're not successful, what he's going to do. But one of the things that disturbed me and a lot of other people from reading is that the Appropriations Committee, after the governor uses his rescission authority to cut where he wants to cut, the Appropriations Committee may hold hearings. Right. And the General Assembly may convene to reject or modify. The operating words being may. Right. Why would you guys, the senators and the General Assembly, why would you cede your authority? This has got nothing to do with Daniel Malloy. It could be anybody else. Right. Why would you cede your balance of power authority to the governor? Why did you give up your right to review?
Well, as you know, the vote on that was a straight party line vote.
Party line.
Every single Republican voted against that. It? And most Democrats did. I don't think all of them did in the House, but in the Senate, all of them did. And frankly, I think it was motivated by the desire to avoid the tough decisions. In other words, next year is going to be an election year. If you, as a senator or a state representative, are voting to cut programs now or cut jobs, you know that's going to be politically unpopular. So this is a way of shifting the blame to the governor and exonerating yourself. I believe that's
so. What you want? It's almost like hiring a consultant sometimes, Len, as the president or board of directors, and you say, "I didn't do it; they did it."
Right, and every one of us knows that. Basically, it's the unstated truth that the Democrats won't acknowledge. They're going to say, "Well, the governor, we're in a tight time frame. Somebody's got to make this decision." But we can meet in a special session. The appropriations can meet on a day or two's notice, basically, and we can act quickly. So that's just an excuse.
Well, I guess as a taxpayer and someone that you represent and other people represent other people, what upsets me is that you have given up. When I say you, not you personally.
Right.
The legislature has given up your right to represent me, in my opinion, in the legislature.
I agree with you 100%. And I'll say something very controversial right now.
Go right ahead.
I'm going to tell you that the failure of the Seebeck agreement was the best thing that could ever happen. The reason is this. In the, quote, $1.6 billion of savings that was involved in the Seebeck agreement, over $600 million of it was totally bogus, absolutely without a shred of evidence or foundation.
The health business.
Yeah, exactly. The Office of Fiscal Analysis couldn't verify any of it. And that meant, if that went through, that we'd be in a constitutional fiscal crisis again next year, because the budget itself is only $1 million below the constitutional spending cap. So if all of a sudden hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts don't actually happen, you're going to be over the spending cap to begin with, which requires the governor to declare a state of emergency, and then he's got to get 60% of the legislature to vote for an amendment to the budget itself. The other thing is this. The budget itself, even with that, had only a built-in surplus of $87.8 million. Jim, that means if half of those phantom savings did materialize and the other half didn't, they'd be in a deficit again next year. The year after the biggest tax increase in the history of the state of Connecticut, we were setting ourselves up for another crisis. I think the governor ought to be thanking his lucky stars that it didn't get approved, because it would be a major league embarrassment to him and the Democratic-controlled legislature.
Okay, we got about 5 minutes left, Lenny. Where do we stand as of right now? What's the status as of this moment?
Well, right now the ball is in the governor's hands. It was given to him by the legislature. He's got to come up with a plan B that could be reviewed by the Appropriations Committee, may not be. It will have to be reviewed by the Speaker of the House and the Senator, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, at least. But that's pro forma, basically. They all want him to just make the tough decisions. Now, given the governor's penchant for phantom cuts, I'm not so confident that he's going to come up with 1.6 billion of real cuts. That remains to be seen.
Lenny, I have an interesting quote for you from your friend Senator Edith Prey, certainly a labor supporter.
Yes.
And she was asked by a reporter about how she felt about what was offered the state of Connecticut employees and their rejection of it. She said, quote, she felt state employees were out of their minds and stupid not to ratify the deal. Now, I mean, she's a very, very strong labor supporter.
The biggest in the Senate.
So, I mean, if I understood that, I mean, there were some things that they gave back, but essentially what it was that was offered was another no layoff situation, which Governor Rell did too. She gave him 2 years of no layoff.
That's right.
And this is 4 years of no layoff. Right? And in the first year, there's a first 2 years there's a wage freeze. And then all of a sudden, over the next 3 years, every year you get 3%.
That's right.
Which is compounded.
Plus the steps.
Plus the steps. Yeah, the increments. What you and I know as increments. So what are you hearing? We got about 3 minutes left. What are you hearing about why the unions turned this down? I mean, that's job security.
I think, truthfully, there was a strong sense of distrust between union members and union leadership. I think there was a convoluted deal too, Jim, by the way. It wasn't like, oh, we're just going to freeze pay for 2 years and we're going to add 3% to your costs of health care insurance. It was a convoluted deal that had all these little cockamamie, the Healthcare Cost Containment Committee was supposed to save $75 million. The labor people themselves and the document they distributed to the union people basically said the Healthcare Cost Containment Committee has failed to contain costs. Yet that was a $75 million of savings built into the savings. I actually was accosted by a fellow parishioner after church on Sunday, accosted in a friendly way. She came up and said, Lenny, I voted for you, this and that. She said, I tell you right now, the state employees were willing to give far more than what the governor was asking, but we didn't like the way he structured it. We didn't like, a lot of this value-added health care stuff.
But right now, Lenny, the governor is saying, essentially, his position right now, because they're overturing to him, let's reopen. Not reopen, let's get together and talk again. And he's saying, you know what, unless you change the rules, I ain't going to do it. Because, you know what, 14 out of 15 said yes, it went down. 53% of your membership said yes, it went down. Change the rules, I'll talk to you. Isn't that essentially his position?
That's basically his position. And, to be honest with you, too, Jim, let's face it, even if they somehow come up with some kind of a deal, it's going to be effective so late into the year. The year won't, we'll be 4 months into the year.
It's like,
what are you going to do?
It's like if you wait 6 months to accrue your savings, you got to double your expense cut reduction in the last 6 months. We got about a minute left, Lenny. One of the things that irritates me is that people have a tendency to blame the unions for the situation we're in. Do I think they deserve part of the blame? Yes. But you know what? Someone had to negotiate their contracts with them. It takes two parties to negotiate a contract, Lenny. And for all these years, people, whomever these people are, have been giving the unions what they want. Now, you know what? That tells me a couple things. Number one, the unions are better negotiators than the state is.
That's right.
Right? Number two, it tells me people are laying down because they want votes when they run for election. With 1 minute left, what's your view of that?
I agree with you. First of all, you can't blame the union members themselves. It was a political deal, a marriage of political convenience between labor leadership and the politicians in the legislature, and it was aided and abetted by a dishonest accounting system. I mean, basically, without GAAP, we were basically creating costs that we weren't accruing for, and so we weren't showing it in the budget, and we're creating this illusion that we had balanced budgets all these years, which we didn't have. So you have those things. I can't blame a union employee. I mean, they got a very good deal that was negotiated by their leadership. What are you going to say to the employees? Oh, you should have rejected that great deal?
Exactly.
No way. There's a lot of good employees. I talked to them one-on-one, many of them during my campaign and afterwards, and they were all willing to sacrifice and give up. So they recognize the situation, but I think there was a disconnect between union leadership and the union.
Lenny, we're going to have to end it on that. We probably could go on for an hour. Best of luck for you, my friend.
You.
You're going to need it. Not necessarily personally, but everybody. And on behalf of the rest of the taxpayers in the state of Connecticut, good luck, Len.
Thank you, Jim.
And we'll be back with our next segment. Thank you, Senator Suzio.
Thank you.